6 felonies. Life without parole. A name that would dominate headlines and courtrooms alike. Holly Johnson. A name that means different things to different people. To some, a cautionary tale. To others, a villain. But before the charges, before the courtroom drama, before the life sentence hung in the balance, there was a series of events that led authorities to one inescapable conclusion. This case demanded justice. Tonight, we unravel the story behind 6 Class M felonies that could lock someone away forever. What did Holly Johnson do? And why does this case continue to captivate and horrify in equal measure? Holly Johnson wasn't born into infamy. Court documents and public records paint a picture of someone living an unremarkable life, until everything changed. Neighbors described a quiet demeanor, someone who kept to themselves. But beneath that surface, investigators would later discover a pattern of behavior that raised red flags. Holly's background became crucial to understanding motive. Employment records, financial statements, and personal relationships were scrutinized. Friends were interviewed. Family members questioned. The person Holly presented to the world didn't match what prosecutors would later allege in charging documents. As investigators dug deeper, they found discrepancies, secrets, and a trail that would lead them to 6 separate criminal acts, each one serious enough to warrant Class M felony status. First alleged crime occurred on a seemingly ordinary day. Witnesses would later testify about unusual activity they noticed but initially dismissed. Security footage became a critical piece of evidence, time-stamped and preserved. Prosecutors alleged that Holly Johnson engaged in conduct that violated state criminal statutes in the most serious degree. The Class M felony designation meant this wasn't a minor infraction, it carried weight, consequence, and the potential for severe punishment. Investigators collected physical evidence from the scene. Forensic teams processed materials that would later be presented in court. What exactly happened during this first incident remained disputed, but the state built its case methodically. Each piece of evidence was cataloged, photographed, and prepared for trial. The foundation was being laid for a prosecution that would seek the maximum penalty. One incident might be explained away. 2 raises questions. But as investigators continued their work, additional allegations emerged against Holly Johnson. The second and third incidents showed striking similarities to the first. Prosecutors argued this demonstrated intent, planning, and a disregard for law and consequence. Defense attorneys would later challenge this characterization, but the evidence mounted steadily. Witnesses came forward with information they'd previously withheld. Digital forensics revealed communications that prosecutors deemed incriminating. Phone records, text messages, email chains, all were subpoenaed and analyzed. Experts testified about patterns of behavior consistent with the charges. The prosecution's theory began to crystallize. These weren't isolated events but connected actions stemming from the same mindset. With each new piece of evidence, the case against Holly Johnson grew stronger, more complex, and more serious. Law enforcement devoted significant resources to building an airtight case. Multiple agencies coordinated their efforts, sharing intelligence and evidence. Search warrants were executed at Holly Johnson's residence and other locations deemed relevant. What investigators found during these searches would prove crucial at trial. Documents were seized, electronics confiscated, and physical evidence collected. Forensic accountants traced financial transactions looking for patterns or motives. Psychological profiles were developed to understand behavior and predict future actions. Interviews with associates, family members, and acquaintances painted a fuller picture. Some defended Holly vehemently. Others expressed shock and disbelief. Still others admitted they'd noticed troubling signs they'd chosen to ignore. The investigation wasn't quick. It was thorough, methodical, and designed to withstand legal scrutiny. Prosecutors knew they were building a case that could result in life imprisonment. As if 3 Class M felonies weren't enough, prosecutors added 2 more charges to the indictment. The 4th and 5th alleged incidents followed similar patterns but introduced new elements that complicated the case. Legal experts noted that each additional charge increased both the potential sentence and the complexity of the defense strategy. Holly Johnson's legal team faced a mounting challenge. How do you defend against multiple serious felonies when the evidence appears interconnected? The prosecution argued that these incidents demonstrated an escalating pattern of criminal behavior. Each event allegedly more brazen than the last, showing a defendant who felt increasingly immune to consequences. Witness testimony corroborated timelines. Physical evidence supported allegations. Digital footprints left electronic trails that investigators followed meticulously. The case was no longer about a single bad decision but an alleged pattern of criminal conduct that demanded accountability. The final charge completed the indictment, 6 Class M felonies in total. This sixth allegation carried particular weight because it allegedly occurred after Holly Johnson knew authorities were investigating. Prosecutors would argue this demonstrated either stunning arrogance or complete disregard for legal consequences. The specifics of this final incident remained heavily debated. Defense attorneys challenged the characterization, the evidence, and the timeline. But prosecutors presented what they believed was conclusive proof. Testimony, physical evidence, and documentation that placed Holly Johnson at the center of criminal activity. This sixth charge would prove crucial during sentencing discussions. It represented not just another crime but evidence of a defendant who wouldn't or couldn't stop even when faced with serious legal jeopardy. For prosecutors seeking life without parole, this final charge became emblematic of why maximum punishment was justified and necessary. To understand the severity Holly Johnson faced, one must understand Class M felonies. In the applicable jurisdiction, these represent the most serious category of criminal offense. They carry mandatory minimum sentences and maximum penalties that include life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The classification isn't arbitrary, it's reserved for crimes deemed so harmful to society that extraordinary punishment is warranted. Each Class M felony conviction can result in decades behind bars. When multiple such felonies are charged together, sentences can run consecutively, creating effective life sentences even without specific, life without parole, provisions. Legal scholars note that prosecutors don't pursue Class M charges lightly. The evidentiary burden is high, the scrutiny intense, and the consequences permanent. For Holly Johnson, facing 6 such charges simultaneously meant confronting the very real possibility of dying in prison. When authorities finally moved to arrest Holly Johnson, they did so with overwhelming force and preparation. Multiple law enforcement vehicles surrounded the location. Officers wore tactical gear, prepared for any contingency. The arrest was executed without incident, but the imagery was stark. A person in handcuffs, rights being read, freedom ending in an instant. Neighbors watched in shock as someone they thought they knew was led away. Local media arrived quickly, cameras capturing footage that would be replayed endlessly on news broadcasts. Holly Johnson's mugshot became public record, circulated on social media, analyzed and discussed by thousands. The presumption of innocence remained legally intact, but public opinion began forming immediately. Bond was set extraordinarily high, effectively ensuring Holly would remain incarcerated pending trial. Legal experts noted this was standard for charges this serious, especially when defendants might pose flight risks. The district attorney's office assembled a specialized team for this case. Senior prosecutors with extensive trial experience took the lead. They understood the stakes. 6 Class M felonies required flawless preparation and execution. Grand jury proceedings resulted in formal indictments on all charges. The prosecution's strategy became clear through pretrial motions and discovery materials. They would present a comprehensive narrative connecting all 6 incidents into one coherent theory of criminal behavior. Expert witnesses were retained: forensic specialists, behavioral psychologists, financial investigators. Each would testify about specific elements supporting the charges. The prosecution timeline stretched back months or even years, documenting an alleged pattern that predated the formal investigation. Evidence was organized meticulously, exhibits numbered in the hundreds. Witness lists grew lengthy. The prosecution signaled its intent. This would be a thorough, aggressive pursuit of maximum accountability for maximum harm. Holly Johnson's defense team faced an enormous challenge but immediately began crafting their counter-narrative. They challenged the prosecution's theory of connected incidents, arguing each allegation should be evaluated independently. Pretrial motions sought to suppress certain evidence, claiming constitutional violations during searches or interrogations. Defense investigators conducted their own interviews, seeking witnesses who might contradict prosecution testimony. Character witnesses were identified, people who would testify about Holly's positive qualities and contributions to community. The defense strategy also included attacking the credibility of prosecution witnesses. Were they reliable? Did they have ulterior motives? Had they been offered deals in exchange for testimony? Defense attorneys scrutinized every piece of physical evidence, looking for contamination, mishandling, or alternative explanations. Expert witnesses were retained to provide contrary interpretations of forensic evidence. The message was clear. The prosecution's case, however impressive it appeared, contained reasonable doubt. As trial approached, media coverage intensified dramatically. Local news stations provided daily updates. National networks picked up the story due to its sensational nature: 6 serious felonies, potential life sentence, dramatic courtroom battles ahead. Social media exploded with opinions, theories, and arguments. True crime podcasters devoted episodes to analyzing the case. Armchair detectives on Reddit and other forums dissected publicly available information, creating theories ranging from plausible to absurd. The court struggled to manage publicity's impact on jury selection. How could they find impartial jurors when the case dominated local conversation? Defense attorneys filed motions for change of venue, arguing pretrial publicity made fair trial impossible in the current jurisdiction. The judge denied the motion but implemented strict jury instructions. Potential jurors faced extensive questioning about media exposure and preformed opinions. The selection process took days, with both sides using challenges strategically. The courtroom was packed as trial commenced. Holly Johnson sat at the defense table, flanked by attorneys, expression carefully neutral. Across the aisle, prosecutors organized massive case files and evidence exhibits. The judge provided preliminary instructions to the jury, explaining burden of proof, presumption of innocence, and their critical role. Opening statements began with the prosecution presenting its roadmap. They outlined the 6 charges methodically, explaining what evidence would prove each element. Their narrative was compelling, delivered with confidence and clarity. The prosecutor's voice resonated as they described alleged victims, harmful consequences, and a defendant who showed no remorse. Then the defense responded. Their opening challenged the prosecution's characterization at every turn. They presented Holly Johnson as someone wrongly accused, a victim of overzealous prosecution and circumstantial evidence misconstrued. The contrast was stark. 2 completely different interpretations of the same facts. Over subsequent weeks, prosecutors methodically presented their evidence. Witnesses testified about what they saw, heard, or experienced. Documents were introduced, authenticated, and explained. Physical evidence was displayed, photographed, and analyzed by experts. Each day built upon the previous, creating an accumulating narrative of guilt. Cross-examination by defense attorneys was aggressive but often seemed to make little headway against prepared prosecution witnesses. Forensic experts explained scientific findings in language jurors could understand. Financial records showed transactions prosecutors deemed suspicious or incriminating. Digital evidence, texts, emails, social media posts were displayed on courtroom screens. Some testimony was emotional, particularly from those allegedly harmed by Holly Johnson's actions. Prosecutors paced their case carefully, knowing juror attention and retention were crucial. They used multimedia presentations, timelines, and demonstrative aids to make complex information accessible. As the prosecution rested, observers noted they delivered exactly what opening statements promised. The defense case presented an alternative narrative. Their witnesses contradicted prosecution testimony on key points. They introduced evidence suggesting explanations for behavior prosecutors called criminal. Character witnesses testified about Holly Johnson's positive reputation, community involvement, and moral character. Defense experts challenged prosecution forensics, suggesting contamination, misinterpretation, or methodological flaws. The defense suggested reasonable doubt existed on every charge. They argued prosecution evidence was circumstantial, context was misunderstood, and rush to judgment had occurred. Holly Johnson took the stand, a risky move defense attorneys carefully considered. Testimony was measured, expressing regret for circumstances but denying criminal intent. Under cross-examination, prosecutors attacked credibility aggressively, highlighting contradictions and inconsistencies. The exchange was tense, dramatic, and closely watched. When defense rested, legal experts debated effectiveness. Had they created reasonable doubt, or merely offered weak explanations for damning evidence? Closing arguments represented each side's final opportunity to persuade. Prosecutors reminded jurors of overwhelming evidence supporting conviction on all 6 counts. They methodically reviewed testimony, documents, and physical evidence, connecting everything into a comprehensive theory of guilt. Their delivery was passionate but controlled, appealing to jurors' sense of justice and community protection. They argued that conviction wasn't just warranted but necessary, that anything less would represent failure of the justice system. The defense countered with equally passionate argument for reasonable doubt. They highlighted inconsistencies in prosecution evidence, unreliable witnesses, and alternative explanations. They reminded jurors of the awesome responsibility they held. A person's entire life hung in balance. The defense urged caution, skepticism of government power, and adherence to, beyond reasonable doubt, standard. Both sides concluded with powerful rhetoric, leaving jurors with much to consider during deliberations. The jury retired to deliberate, and an agonizing wait began. Holly Johnson, family members, alleged victims, and legal teams could only wait as 12 citizens reviewed evidence and debated guilt or innocence. Deliberations stretched across multiple days, suggesting jurors were taking their responsibilities seriously and considering evidence carefully. Occasionally, they sent notes to the judge requesting specific testimony be read back or asking legal clarification questions. Legal observers analyzed each request, trying to divine which direction deliberations were trending. Defense attorneys hoped prolonged deliberations meant disagreement, possible hung jury. Prosecutors remained confident that evidence would ultimately prove persuasive. Inside the deliberation room, jurors reviewed hundreds of exhibits, debated testimony credibility, and applied legal standards to facts. The process was exhausting, emotional, and consequential. Finally, word came. A verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled rapidly as everyone prepared for the moment of truth. Silence filled the courtroom as the jury foreman stood. The judge asked if verdicts had been reached on all counts. "Yes, Your Honor," came the response. 6 separate verdict forms. One for each Class M felony charge. The clerk read each aloud. As to count 1, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Holly Johnson's expression remained controlled, but family members gasped. As to count 2, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The pattern continued through all 6 charges. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 6 convictions on 6 Class M felonies. The courtroom erupted briefly before the judge restored order. Holly Johnson had been convicted on every charge, the maximum possible outcome for the prosecution. Defense attorneys immediately began planning appeals, but the immediate reality was undeniable. Holly Johnson now faced sentencing on 6 of the most serious felonies the legal system recognizes, with life without parole a very real possibility. Weeks later, the sentencing hearing brought everyone back to court. This phase allowed both sides to present arguments about appropriate punishment. Prosecutors advocated for maximum sentences on each count, running consecutively, effectively ensuring Holly Johnson would never leave prison. They presented impact statements from those harmed, describing ongoing trauma and permanent damage. They argued that the severity and number of convictions warranted the harshest possible response. Defense attorneys presented mitigation evidence, Holly's background, mental health factors, lack of prior criminal history, and potential for rehabilitation. They urged concurrent rather than consecutive sentences, arguing that excessive punishment served no legitimate purpose. Holly Johnson addressed the court directly, expressing remorse and asking for mercy. But the judge's decision would ultimately rest on legal factors, sentencing guidelines, and assessment of public safety. The judge took the matter under advisement, promising a decision within days. The wait was excruciating. When the judge finally announced the sentence, the decision was devastating for the defense. On each of the 6 Class M felony convictions, the judge imposed significant prison terms. More critically, the judge ordered several sentences to run consecutively rather than concurrently. The mathematics were brutal. Even with good behavior credits, Holly Johnson would remain imprisoned for life. While technically not a formal, life without parole, sentence, the cumulative effect was identical. Holly Johnson would die in prison. The judge explained the reasoning. The severity of offenses, number of convictions, demonstrated pattern of behavior, and need to protect public safety all justified maximum punishment. Defense attorneys immediately filed notice of appeal, but Holly was remanded to custody to begin serving the sentence. Family members wept. Prosecutors expressed satisfaction that justice had been served. As Holly Johnson was led from the courtroom in shackles, One chapter ended and another began. Decades of incarceration stretched ahead. Today, Holly Johnson remains incarcerated, appeals pending but prospects dim. The case continues generating discussion about justice, punishment, and the legal system's approach to serious repeat offenders. Legal scholars cited in discussions about sentencing reform and proportionality. Victims and their families continue processing trauma, some finding closure in the conviction while others struggle regardless of the outcome. The broader community debates what the case reveals about society, safety, and consequences. Media coverage has diminished but hasn't disappeared. Anniversary stories revisit the case periodically. Holly Johnson's name has become synonymous with serious criminal consequences and the reality that actions carry permanent, life-altering repercussions. The 6 Class M felony convictions stand as testament to what happens when criminal behavior crosses society's most serious boundaries. Justice was pursued, evidence presented, a trial conducted, and a sentence imposed. Whether that represents true justice or excessive punishment depends on perspective. 6 charges, 6 convictions, a lifetime behind bars. The Holly Johnson case reminds us that the justice system, for all its flaws, still functions to hold people accountable for serious criminal conduct. It shows us that Class M felonies aren't abstract legal concepts but real consequences for real harm. This case will be studied, debated, and discussed for years to come. A cautionary tale about choices, consequences, and the permanent impact of criminal behavior. What do you think? Was justice served, or did the system go too far? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into cases that shocked communities and dominated headlines. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, actions have consequences that can last forever.